Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Okay, today we're really unpacking quite a mix of global events. We're pulling together some threads from recent headlines. We've got a major trade agreement, ongoing energy geopolitics, and even some, well, pretty surprising military tech developments.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, how all these things, economic pressure, military innovation, diplomacy, they all paint this picture of a world stage that's just constantly shifting. Our goal here is really to pull out the key insights, see how these different pieces influence each other.
Right. So let's start with the economics, this high-stakes chessboard. We're diving into that big trade agreement between the EU and U.S. President Trump. It was announced July 27th, 2025. And it involved European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen agreeing to terms that, well, some people are calling terrible for Europe.
Mm-hmm. If you look at the details, the deal set a base tariff of 15% on EU goods going to the U.S. Now, that was lower than the 30% U.S. President Trump had threatened before. But beyond tariffs, the EU also committed $600 billion in investment into the American economy over the next 3 years. And critically, the bloc agreed to stop using Russian oil and gas. They committed to replacing them with American energy.
Okay, so $600 billion investment, ditching Russian energy, 15% tariffs. Why would the EU agree to something described as terrible?
Mm-hmm.
What was the thinking there?
Well, from a purely trade standpoint, the analysis suggests it was pretty bad for Europe. Jacob Kierkegaard, a senior researcher at Bruegel, basically said that. But he also pointed out that a responsible leader maybe felt they didn't have much choice. The priority was keeping U.S. President Trump's America, NATO's dominant military power on Europe's side, especially with what they see as, attacks from Russia.
So the security angle.
Exactly. There was apparently real concern among European officials. They worried that if they refused the deal, U.S. President Trump might use it as an excuse to, say, cut military aid to Ukraine or even, significantly pull U.S. troops out of Europe. It seems like a geopolitical trade-off.
Okay, that makes more sense in context. And this kind of pressure, it isn't just on Europe, is it? We're seeing U.S. President Trump also announce new sanctions against India. Partly, it seems, because of India's trade ties with Russia. Mm-hmm. So what's the potential cost for a country like India if they have to switch energy suppliers suddenly?
Well, an energy analytics firm, Coupler, put out some projections. They estimate India's oil import costs could jump by over $9 billion, maybe even $11 billion a year. That's if they stop buying Russian oil. They currently import about 1.8 million barrels a day, and usually at a discount, maybe around $5 a barrel. Plus, there were these warnings floating around 100% tariffs on countries buying Russian oil if Moscow doesn't reach a peace deal with Kyiv. So, serious pressure.
And how are countries reacting? I mean, we saw reports that some Indian state companies maybe paused buying Russian oil at first. Tankers went elsewhere, China, Egypt. But then later reports suggested Indian refineries kept buying. It seems like a mixed response.
It does. And you see different reactions globally. China, for instance, basically said it would take reasonable energy security measures and that, in a tariff war, there are no winners. Mm-hmm. Brazil faced 50% tariffs for its BRICS cooperation. Their response, they halted oil product exports to the U.S., which actually hit the American market pretty hard.
So it raises the question, doesn't it? Does this kind of intense economic pressure always get the political results Washington wants?
That's the key question. And what we might be seeing is, well, maybe not. This round of sanctions, it might not achieve the specific political goals. Instead, it could actually be speeding up things like de-dollarization countries using the dollar less for trade, and maybe boosting the yuan, strengthening trade corridors outside the sort of traditional Western bloc. Some observers are framing this U.S. strategy as maybe more of a risky gamble than a carefully planned move. High stakes, definitely.
Okay, so from that global economic maneuvering, let's shift gears. Let's look at the battlefield. We're seeing some really interesting, maybe unique developments in anti-drone tech. It seems like many armies maybe overlook the FPV drone threat at the soldier level, but Russian President Putin seems to be tackling it differently.
Yeah, there's video footage out there showing a Russian soldier with what looks like a new anti-drone system. It's quite distinctive. 2 antennas on the helmet, they look a bit like insect whiskers. There's a signal amplifier, and this screen, about A5 size, strapped to the arm, kind of like how runners carry their phones. The idea, apparently, is that the system picks up the drone's radio signal, and then this is the interesting part, it reportedly intercepts the drone's video feed and shows it on the soldier's screen.
Intercepts the video feed, not just jamming.
Right. That allows the soldier to disrupt the data transmission. The aim is basically to blind the drone, stop it from being effective in combat.
That is different because normally anti-drone stuff tries to jam control signals or navigation,
Right.
and those signals get weaker further away.
Exactly. But the video signal, that has to be transmitted powerfully to reach the operator clearly, so it's much harder to just suppress or jam effectively. So yeah, if this system really works like described, it's being called a unique development. Could be a real game changer, maybe even like personal life insurance for soldiers facing drones.
How significant could that be? I mean, if it works.
Well, if it's effective, it could mean Russia has gained a real edge in the sort of tech race against drones. Ukraine would need to adapt very quickly. But it's important to note, other militaries are working on this too. The U.S. Marine Corps, for example, they've been trying to improve how individual soldiers can counter drones. The U.S. Department of Defense definitely sees the drone threat to soldiers as strategically important now, largely because of what's happened in Ukraine. The focus everywhere seems to be on making these systems convenient, easy to use, and lightweight.
But there are challenges, right? Current anti-drone gear is often described as, well, bulky, expensive, maybe not even designed specifically for drones sometimes.
That's true. And there's skepticism, too. Some argue that newer drone tech, like using fiber optic cables for communication, could make this kind of signal interception almost impossible. So it really highlights the ongoing struggle for infantry against drones. Even as things like camouflage and disinformation become more and more critical on the modern battlefield, it's a constant back and forth.
So putting these pieces together, the economic pressure, the tech developments, what does it all point to for the situation in Ukraine right now? We're seeing reports, aren't we, of the Russian army expanding this so-called buffer zone, taking places like Chasiv Yar, moving towards Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk.
Yes, those movements are being reported, and alongside that, there's been this huge surge in drone strikes by the Russian aerospace forces. The numbers cited for July alone were over 6,400 drones used against Ukrainian targets, military, industrial. That's reportedly more than in all of 2024 combined.
Wow. And what about Kyiv's position in all of this?
Well, looking at the broader picture, some observations suggest Kyiv's focus right now might be less on, say, immediate military strategy and perhaps more on preparing for potential internal shifts, maybe even some form of capitulation. It's also been noted that after what was described as an anti-corruption dressing down, Kyiv seems to have lost a fair bit of its political and economic independence. It kind of looks like they're waiting for instructions from Western partners who themselves might be a bit unsure about the next moves, a sort of strategic pause, perhaps.
Which leads us back, in a way, to U.S. President Trump's strategy. Is there a suggested endgame here?
One interpretation that's been floated is that a potential goal of this whole gambit, the economic pressure, the positioning, could be to eventually accept Russia's terms in negotiations, and then perhaps shift the blame onto Ukraine for not reaching a peaceful resolution sooner. This might even lead to a leadership change in Kyiv, which some reports suggest is being prepared for. There was that quote attributed to U.S. President Trump, "If you know what the answer will be, why wait?" It sort of hints at that kind of decisive, forward-looking approach.
So wrapping this all up, what are the big takeaways from these interconnected events, the pressure tactics, the responses?
I think it underscores just how complex the global environment is right now. You see these high-pressure tactics being applied economically and militarily, but you also see varied responses, pushback from Brazil, adaptation from China, maybe hedging from India. Combined with the rapid military tent changes, it really paints a picture of a world where old ways of wielding influence are being tested and new power dynamics are definitely emerging. It feels very much like a multipolar landscape taking shape.
Absolutely. A lot to track there. This has been a deep dive into some really crucial global shifts. Economics, technology, conflict dynamics. We've seen how linked they all are.
Indeed. The picture suggests some powers are pushing hard for quick outcomes, using leverage, while others are finding ways to navigate that pressure, assert their own interests. It's leading to a genuinely complex global setup.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.